Hey guys, welcome to this episode of Screen Secrets. Today we're going to be going through the basics of rotoscoping in Nuke. Now, before I get into the actual tutorial, I wanted to explain what exactly rotoscoping is for you guys who don't know. So, rotoscoping is basically the process of tracing certain elements of a live action plate so that you can separate them and treat them as their own separate element. Now, for example, you might have an actor that's not standing in front of a blue or green screen to key. So a roto artist might go in and trace that actor for all the frames so that they can then cut them out and put whatever they want in the background, like a CG render or a matte painting, or even grade the actual actor themselves. The reason I want to really focus on this tutorial is because a lot of people use roto as a stepping stone to other departments such as comp. And the best compers I know have a very solid understanding of rotoscoping, especially. You'd be surprised how little very talented compositors know about rotoscoping, and then when they have to do their own roto, then they get really stuck. So that's why I wanted to really show you this tutorial and not only show you how to use roto, but do roto to the standards that we would expect in an actual studio. So I think we should just jump right into this one. We have our plate here of this actor, and he's holding a box, and our task is going to be to roto the actual box. Now, once we're rotoing, when you do roto it, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can put something behind it, you can grade the box itself, it's kind of whatever, up to you. So the first thing I would do is just spend maybe 5 minutes studying the shot, because you really want to know what the motion is like, what's going on with the actual box itself, and just if there's anything weird to look out for. Now, the reason I chose a box is because it's a fairly simple thing to roto as a first time. There's a lot of distinct corners to look at, and we can focus on those, and it's a good way to practice keeping your actual roto points where they should be rather than them drifting off into places we don't want. To start off, I think we'd want to find us a spot where you can see kind of the most corners of the biggest portion of the box. So just for example, I'm going to start here, and we're going to start with maybe this face of the box. So I'll show you how I approach it. I don't do anything too complicated, and I want to make this as easy of a process for you guys as possible. So just to start off, we're going to create a roto node. The way you can do that is either press O on your key, or you can press tab and search for the roto node here. So we can just double click it and see it comes up with this properties section here. We're not really going to worry about these tabs for now. We can do those later. For now, we're just going to worry about this section here. So right now we can see it will output only an alpha. That's what we care about. And this is the opacity settings, feather settings, fall off, and which keyframe you're on. And this will show you all the actual spline shapes that you have going on. So looking right at the actual roto node, it doesn't show anything. That's basically what it is. It's a blank canvas, and we can basically create our own shapes in it. So when you create it, you'll actually see that nothing happens and you only see your splines. But when you look through the alpha channel, you can see it gives you a black and white mask, and that's basically the foundation of what a roto shape does. It gives you a black and white alpha. The compositor can then use that to cut out whatever they want in the actual plate. So let me run through how to actually check what your roto is doing in conjunction with the plate itself. So I like to call these things they're the red and gray tests, and it'll make sense in a bit. So the first thing we're going to do is create a constant, and the first one we're going to do is make this 100% red, and then we're going to use a key mix and put the A over the B. So A is the red, and it's going to go over the B using our mask, which is going to be our roto. Let me just check that here for now. So if we go in and create our shape, when you create a shape and there's a bit of blur going on, I think for me the best thing to do is put the actual shape in the middle of the blur. And I'll explain why that's important in a bit. There's some studios and some compositors that might prefer you to put the actual shape on the hard edge of the whatever you're rotoing, which is totally fine. This is going to vary based on where you're working, who you're working with, and whatnot. But I'll explain why I like to personally put it in between the two ends of the blur. So you got this outside soft edge and the inside hard edge. And so when I'm creating shapes, I don't want to create too many points like this, because the more points I add, yes, I'm getting more detail in the shape, but then I'm actually adding more work for myself. So I only like to add as many points as I really need. So obviously this one's not needed. We can keep this one here. Now I'll just quickly run through the actual functions of the Bezier spline. So we've created it, and it comes with these little tangents. So the longer these tangents are, the more curved you're able to make this shape. And so that's why I like it, because you don't need to add a lot of points to define the curve. You can just change the tangent length, and you can create whatever curve factor you want. So that's that. This little normal line here, that's actually going to let you pull the feather edge out. This basically is helpful for when you have some motion blur or defocus, and it kind of gives you sort of a linear fall off for the actual spline. So here you can see it's a value of 1, and then it fades out to 0. I personally don't like to use this, only because once you do that, you have an extra element to work with. It kind of adds more work and kind of add more time to the overall work you're doing, and it's just I find it not as intuitive as the natural motion blur that you can add through its processing. So now that we've created our first shape, we can see what it looks like with our red test. So right off the bat, this looks pretty jarring. It's hard to tell what's going on. So the best thing to do is set this to maybe a 50% opacity. The reason I like to do this is because I like to see through the actual shape. So if I go to somewhere that's more bright, you can kind of see what's happening on the edge. You can see, you can have some context as to what position the actual object is that you're rotoing. So a lot of studios prefer to do it this way, and they will ask you to submit your roto pass in this way, so that's how they do the QC. If you're going to ask me personally, this method is fine. It just, for some reason, it makes your roto look a little too good, and I'll show you in a bit why. The other way to check your roto is called the gray test. Now, if we create another keymix, so we copy this one over, and we create another constant, and instead of making this red, we're going to make this sort of a 0.05-ish gray, and just make sure this isn't set to a lower opacity. So here we go. I find this a little better to roto with, just because it gives you more of an indication of what the edges are doing. So if my edge is a little bit too far out here, I can flick between this and the actual plate and see, okay, it's a little far out, so I'm going to pull it in. Whereas if I'm looking through the red, it'll look good kind of regardless of where it's at, and it's a little harder to see how accurate it is. But I do still want to teach this because some studios purely use this method to look at the rotor. So don't discredit that. Just personally, I like to use this. The other reason is because we're viewing this as the constant being outside of what we're rotoing. That's going to be more likely the case of when they put the CG in. It's going to do the same thing where if we're rotoing this box and they're going to put some CG behind it, we want our roto test to look kind of the same, where the gray is sort of an indication of where the CG is going to be. So we've got our first spline drawn in on the first frame. The one thing I'm noticing is the motion blur isn't quite matching our rotor. So as I mentioned before, we can totally go in and pull this feather edge out, and you can see it's kind of done an okay job here. So you can see the fall off is fairly accurate. The only problem is we're going to have to do this for the whole shape, and then the motion blur is going to change. So we're going to have to adjust this, adjust the actual shape itself. It's just going to cause a lot more work than we want it to. So my personal choice here is I like to go here and check the motion blur, the automatic motion blur of the actual rotor shape itself. So what I'm doing here is adding a bit of curvature to the rotor shape. The way you can do that is if you have a hard edge like we have here, and I go in and press Z on it, it's going to expand the tangents of the rotor shape and give it more of a curvature. So now we're going to actually start rotoing it, and here's how I like to kind of go about rotoing a shot. So we know the shot, the box is kind of going from here and it's going to here. What people tend to do is they'll start on one frame, go to the next frame, and just start pulling in the edges, thinking, okay, it looks kind of right, and then move each point individually. You want to try avoiding using as many, like a lot of keyframes, and you want to let Nuke's interpolation do most of your job. The reason I say that is because if you move every single frame and move every individual point individually, you're going to notice some bubbling, some boiling happening within the actual rotor shape. So instead of doing that, we're going to have our first keyframe here. We're going to Control Z until we have it on one keyframe here. And then we're going to let the shot play a few frames and see, okay, when does the actual motion of the box change? So we can see it's kind of a relatively constant motion here, and then it rotates. So about here we're going to create our second keyframe, and instead of moving the points individually, highlight all the points and move them all at once. Because another thing to keep in mind is that we want to try to keep the shape of our rotor shape fairly consistent, and the way you do that is to move it in chunks at a time rather than individually. Yes, you will have to move some points by themselves, but if you can move them in kind of portions and groups, you'll have a much better time, and in terms of the QC, there'll be less bubbling and boiling happening within the shape. So to get this in the right space, we're going to highlight all of them. You can rotate it like this, and now you just zoom in, go in. Make sure the in the blurry bits like here, have your point in the middle of the actual blur. And in a second I'll explain why I do that. So we're just gonna do it like this. And we have our second keyframe here. And then in between these two keyframes here, I'm just going to create an in and out point. So if you click on an actual key frame here, and then you press O, it creates an out point, and you press I, it creates an in point. So between the actual keyframes that we have, I'm going to play it and see how it goes. So to test the actual rotor, we can look at the gray checker or a red checker or the actual plate itself and drag through the timeline to see. Now, off the bat, I can see it's got the relative position right, but it's not as accurate as we'd like it to be. So we go to the first frame and then start scrubbing to where it's broken the most, I'd say around here, and we're going to create our third keyframe in between the two keyframes that we made. So now highlight all of them. Remember, don't individually move them, because then the shape of the actual spline will deform. You'll get a bit of wobbling in the shape and the animation. So move it there and have you in the middle there, and we're just going to move these here. Now, another very important point I'd like to make is wherever you make the actual points, keep them in the same position of what you're rotoing throughout the whole shot. So if I've put a point on this corner of the box, it's going to stay there forever. It's not going to move here. This point isn't going to move to here. Otherwise, you're going to run into a lot of problems. Your rotor shape is going to be wobbling a lot. You're going to get weird motion blur issues. So it's a very, very essential point that I'd like to make, is to keep your rotor points on the same location as where they were when you first made them. Cool. So now we have our middle keyframe, and you can see Nuke has done a pretty good job of interpolating the motion blur between these two keyframes. Now, I'll explain why I like to actually put these points in the middle of the motion blur rather than on the hard edge or the outside edge. So if we put it in the hard edge like I've done right here, the thing with motion blur is it takes the position of the point and blurs outwards in both directions. So now if we look here, some of our rotor shape isn't blurring into the actual box itself, and we're getting some non-solid kind of values of the actual rotor shape. So you can see a bit of fall off happening around here, whereas when we look at the actual plate itself, this is supposed to be solid black. But as I said before, some studios, some compositors might prefer you to do it that way, and the important thing in that case is however you decide to roto it, whether you're in or whether you're out, as long as you're consistent the whole way through and it doesn't change, it should be okay. Just for my demonstration purposes, I'd like to keep this in the middle here. Cool. So now if we look through the gray checker and press play, looks like we've got a relatively okay rotor spline happening, but we're definitely going to go in and fix a lot of the points, because as you can see, looks good on this keyframe and then not on the next one. And it might even come to a point where we go in and start going through every frame and adjusting it. Now, as I said before, don't try not to manipulate individual points. Try to move them all as a whole. So like here, I'm going to go in, select the whole thing, and then move it all down like that. And we're in a pretty good situation here. And just checking this one, make sure this is in the middle of the actual blur. I know I seem very pedantic when it comes to the details, but when you're working for a real studio, they're going to look out for this, and once it comes to the tech check side of your comp or your work, they're going to definitely point this out. So yeah, looks like a good frame there. Maybe adjust this one here, and then we're going to go to the next frame, and yes, we can see our shape is moving out a little, and it's gone in here, and so we're just going to kind of focus on this one sort of set of frames until it looks good. Now, just quickly, I'm going to show you the red checker. Yeah, so as I said before, the red checker it's a good way to check your rotor. It's just that if you don't know what to look for, it'll kind of make everything look really good, and you'll think it works really well until you might put the actual CG render in it, and then you'll notice all the issues. That's why I like to use the gray checker. It kind of reveals all the problems you have going on in it. But that could be a personal choice. It could be the choice of the studio as to how they want it to be done. I just want to show you both ways so that you at least have the knowledge. Okay, so now we're pretty much done with this set of frames, and once you press play, we're going to see how it looks. Yeah, so I think we got a good result going on. You can see a bit of the background showing through. That's completely normal. It's because we have a transparent edge and a really bright background compared to a really dark foreground. So if you are worried about that, don't worry, as long as you can kind of determine that your shape is fairly consistent, which it looks like it is here, you should be good. Now, so if you were to do the shot, you would then go to the next couple of frames, see where the motion kind of changes, and then focus on that set of frames, and then go on and on and on. Now, there's a portion where that face of the box actually goes away, is when I put the box against the wall here, so you can see this dark part of the box actually goes away. When that happens, there's no reason to keep the box, the rotor there, so we're actually going to turn it off. So let's just say we rotoed it up to here, we got our keyframes going here, we got our splines here. Just for example, we got it like this, and it looking awesome. And then the box face goes away. Instead of keeping the shape there and floating in space, we're going to just turn it off through the opacity. So if you go to the right here, right click, set key from 1 and then set it to 0, it'll turn off the shape, and then when you double click somewhere else, it'll actually disappear your spline. That's how I like to just turn off shapes rather than just flinging them off frame or keying the visibility. Just easiest way is to turn off the opacity. So you could film something similar to this, spend around 3 to 4 hours rotoing it. I spent about that much of time doing it, and if you want to see kind of a breakdown of my splines, I did a version here earlier where I completed the actual shot, and you can see for each face of the box I've created one shape, and if you look through each of the actual splines, there's not that many points. It's very simple, very easy, and this is a really good practice shot for you guys to kind of get used to roto. And you can play it through and you'll see it looks fairly consistent, and I like to, over some time I'll go in and just let it play over and over again and see how it looks through the gray checker, maybe through the red checker, and see if there's any popping or any odd anomalies happening throughout the alpha. So what you can do is kind of go through each kind of keyframe, look at the plate, and then look at the gray, and then kind of do a rapid 1, 2, 1, 2, and we can see, okay, is the gray eating in or is it expanding too much? So, for example, let's take this frame here. We can see a little bit of the motion blur is eating in a little bit into the box itself. Now, that's not a problem. We're just going to go into the actual rotor shape. We're going to check it out. And yeah, we can see it's a little bit cut in here. We're just going to take it, pull it out slightly, and it looks like we're in a good spot now. I think the best thing you can do is go out with your phone, with any camera you have, film a really basic shot of you doing something, film an object like a tree, and do your own roto to it. See what kind of issues you come across. Play around with the motion blur, play around with different types of splines. See what happens when you put the brightness of your gray test too much, make it really dark. Play around with it, make a lot of mistakes. You're not gonna be perfect for the first time. It might take you a few tries to actually get a good articulate matte happening. So yeah, and if there's something you notice that I maybe didn't cover right, or something I should explain further, or a particular shot you'd like me to go through, definitely leave it in the comments. I'd love to read them, and then maybe in the future I'll do a more advanced roto technique and something a little more harder, and then you can see my thought process as to how I would go about doing this. But there's definitely going to be more videos to come. I'm going to explain why rotoing is so important in the industry, why I think you should consider it as a career path into maybe comp, or maybe just as it is. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.